The slap cracked through the dining room like a gunshot, sudden and vicious, slicing through the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the low hum of expensive conversations. Every sound died instantly. Heads snapped toward the disturbance. A waiter froze mid-step. A woman seated near the window covered her mouth in shock. For a heartbeat, the entire restaurant seemed to stop breathing. In the center of it all stood Ashley Whitmore, her hands still suspended in the air. A satisfied smile curled across her lips, the kind of smile perfected over years of getting exactly what she wanted. It was the expression of someone who had spent her entire life believing consequences were reserved for other people. The woman she had slapped offered no reaction. She didn't stagger backward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even touch her cheek. Instead, she remained perfectly still, her calmness somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. It was the stillness of someone who had already made a decision. Someone who understood that certain moments changed lives forever. Ashley couldn't have known it then, but in less than 5 seconds, she had made the worst mistake of her 26 years. And the woman standing before her was about to place a single phone call that would threaten everything her father had spent 2 decades building. Maya Brooks returned to Caldwell City on a Tuesday. She had always believed Tuesday was the most honest day of the week. Monday carried false promises and fresh starts. Friday arrived wrapped in relief. But Tuesday asked for nothing. It simply existed, steady and uncomplicated. She drove herself from the airport, politely refusing the luxury car service that had been offered. She preferred the quiet anonymity of a rental sedan, the windows lowered slightly and the radio switched off. Thinking came easier that way, and she had plenty to think about. Caldwell City felt both familiar and foreign. She had grown up in the Eastern District, in a narrow row house where her father spent countless evenings hunched over stacks of paperwork spread across the kitchen table. At 18, she left and rarely looked back. The following decade carried her through some of the most influential institutions in the country. Law school in Philadelphia, a competitive fellowship in New York, and 3 demanding years with a nonprofit oversight coalition in Washington before she eventually established herself as an independent investigative consultant. At 28, Maya looked younger than she was. People frequently mistook that for vulnerability. She had stopped correcting them years ago. She wasn't the kind of woman magazines rushed to place on their covers, but there was something undeniably striking about her. Her dark skin seemed to catch the light and hold it. Her face carried a quiet composure that made people feel noticed while simultaneously making them uncomfortable. She wore her natural hair, cropped close, and dressed with deliberate simplicity. Nothing flashy, nothing distracting. The sort of appearance that suggested her attention was focused on things far more important than fashion. As she drove through the city, she studied the changes. The waterfront had been transformed. Luxury hotels stood where the old cannery once operated. The north side now featured a landscaped greenway lined with bicycle paths and young trees. Colorful banners hung from lampposts declaring Caldwell City, moving forward together, with the mayor's name printed neatly beneath the slogan. Mayor Richard Whitmore. Maya had spent the last 18 months reading everything written about him. More importantly, she had spent nearly as much time reading everything that hadn't been written. Richard Whitmore was 54 years old and entering his 6th year as mayor. Tall, silver-haired, and endlessly confident, he possessed the kind of charisma that made people trust him before he had said a single word. Reporters loved him. Cameras loved him. He appeared at community events with rolled-up sleeves and polished smiles, projecting accessibility while revealing almost nothing of substance. It was a skill he had mastered. His first re-election campaign had ended in a landslide victory. His team celebrated the result as historic. Independent observers described it differently. They called certain numbers unusual, certain patterns suspicious. But suspicion without proof remained little more than speculation. Now he was pursuing another term, and the numbers remained firmly in his favor. His approval rating stood at 61%. His daughter's numbers, had anyone bothered measuring them, would have painted a very different picture. Ashley Whitmore had spent her entire life inside a world carefully designed around her comfort. As Richard Whitmore's only child from his first marriage, she had grown up benefiting from his influence without ever understanding the work that created it. Attractive in the conventional sense, she photographed well enough to pursue a brief modeling career at 20. Depending on who was listening, she later described that period as either a creative passion or a strategic business endeavor. In reality, it had been neither. Her true talents lay elsewhere. Ashley excelled at spending money and identifying people she could use. She moved through Caldwell City's social circles with absolute confidence, carrying herself like someone who had never considered the possibility of hearing the word no. Local media treated her politely, as they did all political families. Privately, however, many journalists had less flattering opinions. Over the years, Ashley had accumulated a trail of incidents that somehow never became scandals. A restaurant server publicly humiliated in 2019. A parking dispute mysteriously resolved after a discreet call from City Hall. A former friend who once threatened to expose Ashley's behavior at a charity event before abruptly deciding not to speak publicly again. The details changed, but the outcome remained the same. Problems disappeared. That was one of the advantages of being Richard Whitmore's daughter. But Maya hadn't returned because of Ashley. She had come because of Gerald Holt. For 11 years, Gerald served as deputy director of the city's infrastructure procurement office before being quietly transferred to a powerless desk position 3 months earlier. He had contacted Maya through a trusted intermediary. He claimed to possess documents, internal emails, financial records. But what made him truly valuable wasn't the paperwork. It was his memory. Gerald had attended meetings that were never fully documented. He had witnessed handshakes that never appeared in official records. He remembered conversations that no shredder could destroy and no deleted file could erase. For 3 months, Maya verified every claim he made. She cross-checked dates, contracts, names, and transactions until the scattered pieces formed a picture too clear to ignore. What she uncovered was disturbing enough to justify her return. Tonight, she was meeting Gerald at the Meridian, Caldwell City's most expensive restaurant. Gerald had insisted on the location, arguing that nobody would expect a confidential meeting in such a public place. Maya agreed, though she privately appreciated another advantage. If something went wrong, there would be witnesses. She parked 2 blocks away and walked the remaining distance. Her low heels clicked softly against the pavement. The evening air carried the sweet warmth of late summer, and the city sparkled around her with deceptive charm. From a distance, Caldwell looked prosperous, hopeful, and clean. Appearances, Maya knew, could be misleading. At 7:43 p.m., she stepped through the Meridian's glass doors. After giving her name to the host, she was escorted to a secluded VIP section tucked near the rear of the restaurant. White tablecloths, amber lighting, and carefully controlled silence created the perfect setting for conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. She ordered water and checked her phone. Gerald was running 10 minutes late. Maya folded her hands and waited with the patience she had developed over years of investigative work. The most important moments rarely arrived on schedule. She didn't actually hear Ashley Whitmore enter. She felt it. The atmosphere shifted. Conversations subtly changed direction. Eyes turned. Attention moved through the room like an invisible wave. Ashley arrived surrounded by 4 companions, all dressed as though they expected to be photographed. Expensive perfume lingered in their wake. Their laughter carried farther than necessary. The host greeted Ashley by name. She never acknowledged him. Instead, she scanned the room with practiced confidence, evaluating everyone in sight, assessing, categorizing, dismissing. Then her gaze landed on Maya, and for the briefest moment, Ashley paused. It was the pause of someone encountering a person who didn't fit neatly into any category she understood. A pause that would soon change everything. Maya noticed the stare immediately. She let it pass and returned her focus to the table. A few moments later, Ashley and her entourage settled 2 tables away, close enough that their voices drifted through the room like background music. Their conversation was filled with recognizable names, exclusive invitations, and carefully chosen references designed to remind everyone nearby who they were. Ashley ordered champagne without even glancing at the wine list. One of her friends cracked a joke, and the group erupted into laughter. Ashley smiled too, but only with her mouth. Her eyes kept drifting back toward Maya. Maya recognized that look. She had seen it in boardrooms, political fundraisers, and private clubs across the country. It was the look of someone trying to decide whether another person belonged. More importantly, it was the look of someone who believed they had the authority to make that decision. Maya kept her posture relaxed and her expression neutral. She deliberately avoided looking up. Eye contact would be interpreted as an invitation, and she wanted no part of whatever Ashley was preparing. She wanted Gerald to arrive. She wanted the documents. She wanted to return to her hotel room, spread everything across a desk, and spend the night connecting the final pieces of a puzzle she had spent months assembling. Unfortunately, Ashley Whitmore had never been particularly skilled at minding her own business. A comment floated across the room, something about certain people assuming they could sit wherever they pleased. One of Ashley's friends snickered. The remark wasn't aimed at anyone directly, which made its target obvious. It was the kind of insult designed to travel without accountability. Maya ignored it. Another comment followed moments later. This one concerned standards slipping. The champagne arrived. Ashley accepted the glass without acknowledging the server, took a slow sip, and then rose from her chair. Maya heard the movement. Still, she didn't look up. Ashley crossed the distance between the tables in 4 deliberate steps. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. Conversation slowed. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Attention spread through the restaurant like a silent ripple across water. "Excuse me," Ashley said. Her voice was polished and pleasant, the voice of someone praised her entire life for being charming. Maya finally looked up. "I think you're sitting in the wrong section." Their eyes met. "I don't think I am," Maya replied calmly. For a split second, surprise crossed Ashley's face. Not anger. Not yet. Surprise. The absence of immediate submission seemed to confuse her. "This area is reserved," Ashley said. "I have a reservation." The response was simple, direct, and completely free of apology. Something hardened behind Ashley's eyes. She wasn't accustomed to resistance. Certainly not resistance delivered so calmly. A few words became several. Most of them came from Ashley. Her voice grew sharper, faster, more irritated, each sentence carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who had mistaken personal inconvenience for genuine injustice. Maya responded only once more, briefly, quietly, without changing her tone. Then everything happened at once. In front of 43 witnesses who would later recount the moment in remarkably similar detail, Ashley Whitmore raised her hand and struck Maya across the face. The crack echoed through the restaurant. Flat, clean, final. Silence followed. Complete silence. Ashley remained standing there, her hands still partially raised. Then came the smile. It appeared automatically. The unconscious expression of someone who believed the world would once again bend itself around her actions, just as it always had. Her friends watched eagerly. Several phones were already pointed toward the scene. Near the bar, a man stood halfway out of his chair before slowly sitting back down. The maitre d' looked as though all the color had drained from his body, and no one spoke. No one moved. Then Maya calmly lifted her hand and touched the corner of her mouth. She looked at her fingertips, lowered her hand, reached inside her jacket, and removed her phone. What unsettled the witnesses later wasn't the slap. It was Maya's reaction. There was no anger, no humiliation, no visible emotion at all. She dialed a number from memory and lifted the phone to her ear. The call lasted 31 seconds. "Eleanor," Maya said. A pause. "It's time." Another pause. "Yes, we're ready." She glanced briefly around the restaurant. The Meridian. A final silence. "I'll explain when you arrive." "Thank you." The call ended. She placed the phone face down on the table. Across from her, Ashley watched. The triumph on her face had begun to fade. Something uncertain had replaced it. "That's it?" Ashley asked. "You're just going to make a phone call?" Her friends laughed. Someone added a comment, meant to sound clever. Maya didn't respond. She simply poured herself a glass of water, took a sip, set the glass down, and waited. The next 9 minutes would become the longest 9 minutes Ashley Whitmore had ever experienced, though she wouldn't realize it until much later. She returned to her table, finished her champagne, ordered another, laughed at jokes, participated in conversations. But something had changed. The laughter sounded forced now. The confidence wasn't quite as natural. Somewhere beneath the surface, a small voice had started asking questions. At the 8th minute, one of her friends suddenly looked toward the entrance and fell silent. At the 9th minute, Ashley turned as well. 3 black SUVs had pulled up outside. Their engines were already off. Their passengers were already moving. Men and women in dark suits entered through the restaurant's glass doors with the calm efficiency of people who knew exactly why they were there. They moved without hesitation, as though every second of the operation had already been planned. The maitre d' stepped forward, then immediately stepped back. 2 agents briefly displayed credentials. They never broke stride. The entire restaurant grew silent again, not because people understood what was happening, because they didn't. And uncertainty is often more frightening than certainty. Then another figure entered, a woman in her mid-50s. Silver-streaked hair pulled neatly back, dark blazer, low heels, a face marked by decades of difficult decisions and the confidence that comes from surviving every one of them. She didn't look left. She didn't look right. She walked directly toward Maya's table. "Maya," she said. There was warmth in her voice. But there was something else too. Respect. The genuine kind. The kind that couldn't be faked. "Eleanor," Maya replied, standing briefly. "Thank you for coming." Ashley stared. She knew that face. She had seen it before. National news broadcasts, federal announcements, investigative hearings. Suddenly she remembered. Eleanor Grant. 18 months earlier, she had been appointed Special Federal Inspector General, leading a broad corruption investigation spanning multiple cities across the country. Ashley remembered her father mentioning the appointment. He had sounded calm at the time, almost too calm. Now that memory felt different, dangerous. Eleanor never looked in Ashley's direction. Instead, she sat across from Maya and opened a leather portfolio. "The warrant is signed," she said quietly. "The teams are in position." She turned a page. "We can move tonight or tomorrow. It depends on where you are with the meeting." Maya nodded, then began speaking. Eleanor listened carefully. Every word mattered. 2 tables away, Ashley felt something she hadn't felt in years. Fear. Real fear. Cold and unfamiliar. One of her friends leaned closer. "Who is she?" the friend whispered. Ashley didn't answer. Her mind was racing, searching for explanations, looking for a version of reality where she remained the most important person in the room. Every calculation ended the same way. She couldn't find one. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. She had publicly humiliated the wrong woman. And whatever this situation was, it had just become much bigger than a restaurant incident. Far bigger. The documents Maya placed on the table revealed a story 6 years in the making. It started with a city infrastructure contract, a $140 million agreement awarded during Mayor Whitmore's first term to a company called Meridian Structural Solutions, a name Maya had privately noted with grim irony. Independent engineering reviews obtained through records requests, whistleblower testimony, and financial analysis estimated the project should have cost no more than $89 million. That left a difference of $51 million. Money that hadn't disappeared through legitimate overruns. Money that had traveled elsewhere. The funds had been routed through consulting agreements, subcontractors, and a web of shell corporations before ultimately reaching 11 individuals. 7 were directly connected to Richard Whitmore's campaign network. 2 served on city boards appointed by Whitmore himself. 1 was Whitmore's brother-in-law, who operated a project management company in Delaware. And that was only the beginning. The first contract. The first layer. There were 4 more. Gerald Holt had known about every single one of them. And before the night was over, so would everyone else. Gerald Holt knew everything because he had been there for all of it. He had sat in the meetings, occupied the chairs around the conference tables, and listen to the conversations where decisions were quietly made long before they appeared in official records. Gerald wasn't a schemer. He wasn't motivated by revenge. He was simply the kind of man who believed in documentation. For more than 11 years, he had developed the habit of writing things down, convinced that institutional memory was fragile and that important truths had a way of disappearing unless someone preserved them. So he wrote. He filled notebooks, recorded dates, documented conversations, stored observations that most people would have forgotten. Those notes eventually filled a safe in his home. When his sudden reassignment came and the message behind it became impossible to ignore, Gerald understood what was happening. He recognized the warning for what it was. After weeks of hesitation, he carefully reached out through a chain of trusted contacts until his path crossed Maya's. Or perhaps Maya's crossed his. The story could be told either way. 18 minutes after Eleanor Grant arrived at the Meridian, Gerald walked through the restaurant doors. He looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like a man who had spent months carrying a weight he could no longer bear. He sat beside Maya with the deliberate calm of someone who had finally made an irreversible decision. Then he placed a small encrypted drive on the table. Beside it, a handwritten statement, his formal testimony, the final piece Maya needed. Across the room, Ashley had completely abandoned the pretense of disinterest. She sat rigidly in her chair. Her second glass of champagne remained untouched. Federal investigators moved quietly through the restaurant, speaking in low voices while more vehicles gathered outside. Nothing about their behavior seemed rushed. That was what made it unsettling. Everyone already knew their role. Everyone already knew the plan. The machine was moving. And once it started moving, machines like this rarely stopped. At one point, Ashley heard her father's name. Not spoken dramatically. Not shouted. Not accused. Simply mentioned as part of a conversation. Like a fact. Like any other fact. Richard Whitmore. The sound of it sent a chill through her. For the first time all evening, she felt genuinely afraid. Richard Whitmore received the call at 11:47 p.m. He was sitting in his home office reviewing polling data with his chief of staff. The numbers were excellent, strong enough that another re-election campaign felt less like a challenge and more like an inevitable formality. Then his phone rang. The name on the screen immediately tightened something in his chest. It wasn't someone who called casually. It wasn't someone who called with good news. The contact appeared in his phone under a set of initials only. A precaution he had considered clever. For years, that number had represented a category of problem he believed would remain theoretical. Now it was calling. Richard excused himself from the room with practiced composure and stepped into the privacy of his study. He answered, then walked to the window. Outside, Caldwell City's skyline stretched across the darkness. The waterfront redevelopment, the illuminated greenway, the buildings and projects that had become symbols of his administration. 6 years of influence. 6 years of carefully cultivated power. 6 years of decisions, alliances, and compromises. And as he listened, something began to crack. Not visibly, not yet, but internally. He said almost nothing during the call, asked only 3 questions, received 3 answers, then ended the conversation. For several minutes afterward, he remained motionless at the window. In the next room, his chief of staff waited with polling reports spread across the table. The numbers still showed 61% approval, but those numbers no longer meant what they had meant earlier that evening. By morning, they might not mean anything at all. Richard's first response was predictable. He did what powerful men often do when confronted with danger. He tried to control it. Lawyers were called. 3 of them. A prominent local firm, a national firm in the capital, and a personal attorney who had handled sensitive matters for 15 years. Phone calls followed. Council members, political allies, business contacts, people who owed favors, people who feared losing access, people Richard believed would stand between him and disaster. His communications director drafted statements before sunrise. The investigation, they claimed, was politically motivated. A coordinated attack. An attempt to sabotage a successful reform administration. The language was polished, confident, purposefully vague. Specifics were dangerous. Generalities were safer. But public messaging wasn't the only strategy being deployed. Other calls were made. Different conversations occurred behind closed doors. Two witnesses connected to Gerald Holt were approached by strangers who delivered carefully crafted warnings. The language never crossed the line into explicit threats. It didn't need to. The message was understood. One witness immediately contacted Maya's team and reported the encounter. The report was added to the case file under a new heading, Witness Intimidation. A second witness, former procurement officer Sandra Kelleher, received 3 anonymous text messages over 48 hours. Then came a voicemail. The number traced back to a prepaid phone purchased with cash. Sandra had worked in government for 22 years. She wasn't easily rattled. Instead of deleting the message, she preserved it and forwarded everything directly to Eleanor Grant's office. Maya experienced pressure too, just a different kind. An anonymous email arrived through multiple routing layers. A technology consultant later traced portions of the chain back to a shell company operating from a business address in Caldwell City. The message informed Maya that complaints had supposedly been filed against her investigative license. It suggested oversight reviews were underway. It warned that continuing her work could negatively affect her career. The final paragraph recommended she redirect her attention elsewhere. Maya read the email twice, forwarded it to Eleanor, then ignored it. A few days later, a respected colleague called with what sounded like friendly advice. The Whitmore investigation, he explained carefully, was becoming politically radioactive. There were risks, complications, future consequences. He suggested there were graceful ways to step away, ways to preserve professional credibility, ways to survive long enough for future battles. Maya listened politely, thanked him, hung up, then sat alone in her hotel room and thought about her father. Marcus Brooks had worked 23 years in public service. A quiet man, a reliable man, the kind of person who believed accountability wasn't just a slogan. It was supposed to mean something. When Maya was in high school, Marcus discovered evidence of contract fraud inside his department. He followed procedure, reported it through official channels. The system failed him. He escalated, went higher, then higher again. Eventually, he went to the press. The retaliation arrived quickly. He lost his job. Legal pressure followed. Financial pressure followed. Stress became illness, and illness became something worse. Marcus Brooks died of a heart attack at 52. For years before the investigation proved he had been right. For years before charges were filed. For years before anyone publicly acknowledged what he had sacrificed. Maya was 23 when the final case closed. She learned about it while eating lunch at her desk in Philadelphia. A brief article, a few paragraphs, a delayed victory. She didn't cry. That grief had already happened. Instead, something sharpened inside her. A realization, a sense of purpose, like a camera lens finally snapping into focus. In that moment, she understood exactly what the rest of her life would be. She rarely shared that story. She wasn't interested in turning personal pain into a credential. But the memory remained. Permanent, structural, not something she carried in her hands. Something she carried inside the framework of who she was. It shaped every choice she made, every investigation she accepted, every fight she refused to abandon. The public hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in September. A joint oversight committee, working alongside Eleanor Grant's office, would oversee the proceedings. The hearing chamber seated 300 people. Every seat was occupied. News cameras lined the rear wall. Reporters crowded the aisles. The atmosphere felt less like a hearing and more like a reckoning. Richard Whitmore arrived surrounded by attorneys, advisors, and communication staff. He wore a charcoal suit, a blue tie, campaign colors. Supporters greeted him near the entrance holding signs that read, "Stand strong, Mayor Whitmore." He smiled, shook hands, posed for photographs. Anyone looking from a distance might have mistaken the event for another campaign stop. When his turn came, he spoke for 12 minutes. He called the investigation political revenge, a coordinated assault, an attempt to destroy a public servant who had challenged entrenched interests. From a purely performative standpoint, it was an impressive speech. His voice never shook. His pacing was controlled. His eye contact was flawless. He looked angry, offended, wrongfully accused. Everything except frightened. Supporters applauded. The room listened. Then Maya stood, and everything changed. For 47 minutes, she presented evidence. No dramatic speeches. No emotional appeals. No theatrical flourishes. Just facts. Dates. Contracts. Transactions. Names. One document after another. One connection after another. Months of investigative work arranged in precise order. Every claim supported. Every figure verified. Every conclusion independently traceable. She walked the committee through each contract, each company, each payment, each shell corporation, every pathway the money followed. Large screens above the committee displayed procurement emails recovered during the investigation. The messages appeared ordinary at first glance. Routine, professional, unremarkable. But ordinary language can become devastating when placed beside evidence, especially when written by people who never expected anyone else would read it. And as the emails filled the screens, a silence began spreading through the hearing room. Because for the first time, everyone could see the entire picture. And there was no longer anywhere left to hide. Point one by one, Maya named all 11 individuals connected to the scheme. She outlined exactly how each person was tied to the mayor's network. Then she introduced Gerald Holt's formal testimony into the official record. Gerald himself sat 2 rows behind her, dressed in the best suit he owned. When his name was read aloud, he simply nodded once. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of 11 years. Several committee members had entered the hearing visibly skeptical. Their expressions suggested they suspected political motives, hidden agendas, or personal vendettas. But skepticism began disappearing as the evidence accumulated. By the 40-minute mark, the atmosphere in the room had shifted noticeably. One council member who had publicly supported Richard Whitmore for 3 consecutive terms requested permission to leave during the recess. He never returned. Ashley sat in the gallery. She had attended out of loyalty. Stubborn loyalty. The kind children often feel toward their parents, even when uncertainty begins creeping in around the edges. She believed showing up was the least she could do. She had spent extra time getting ready that morning. Carefully chosen clothes. Carefully applied makeup. A deliberate effort to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. Beside her sat her aunt, her mother's sister, who had driven 4 hours to attend. The woman loved Ashley's family, though, if she were being honest, she had never completely trusted Richard. Ashley watched her father deliver his speech and felt the familiar swell of pride. But mixed into that pride was something new, something colder, the same feeling that had settled inside her at the Meridian and refused to leave. Then Maya stood, and Ashley watched the room change. Committee members leaned forward. Expressions shifted. The giant screens above the hearing chamber filled with documents, numbers, contracts, and names. Facts, evidence, connections. Somewhere during the second half of Maya's presentation, Ashley realized she wasn't breathing normally anymore. Her chest felt tight. The room suddenly seemed too warm. Then she saw a familiar name. Her uncle's company. She had known it handled city contracts. Her father had mentioned it years earlier, describing it as an example of local businesses helping strengthen the community. Ashley had accepted the explanation without question, because questioning it would have required examining things she didn't want to examine. There are truths people avoid when they love someone. There are questions people refuse to ask when their entire life rests upon the answers. More names appeared, more dates. Conversations she'd overheard years ago suddenly resurfaced. Phone contacts she remembered seeing on her father's screen. Half-forgotten moments. Tiny details, each one insignificant alone. Together, they formed a picture she had spent years unconsciously refusing to see. Ashley didn't cry. Not there. Not in public. She sat perfectly still. Perfect posture. Expression controlled. Watching everything unfold like someone witnessing a collision in slow motion. A disaster she could see coming. A disaster she could do nothing to stop. When a recess was called, She quietly left the hearing room. She found the nearest restroom, turned on the cold water, and held her wrists beneath the stream. For several moments, she simply stared at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked familiar, yet somehow wasn't. Ashley would later realize that moment mattered, because it marked the beginning of something, the beginning of seeing. The afternoon session contained one final surprise, a witness no one outside the committee had been told about. His appearance followed a brief private consultation between Eleanor Grant and the committee chair. When the hearing resumed, a man stepped forward and took a seat at the witness table. His name was David Park, 34 years old, former employee of the mayor's executive communications office. For 3 years, he had served as a recording secretary for private senior staff meetings before quietly resigning 14 months earlier. No public explanation had ever been given. David carried a tablet, enclosed in a protective case. When asked to present his evidence, he connected the device to the room's audio system. Then he pressed play. The recording lasted 42 seconds. 42 seconds that would ultimately destroy an administration. At first, only ambient room noise could be heard. Then came voices. One voice in particular. Every person in the room recognized it immediately. They had listened to it earlier that morning. Richard Whitmore. But the voice on the recording sounded very different from the one heard during his speech. This voice wasn't outraged, wasn't defensive, wasn't performing innocence. It was calm, efficient, specific. The recording captured detailed instructions regarding a contract award. It outlined exactly how funds would move through predetermined channels. Named recipients, dollar amounts, timelines, and then came a sentence that seemed to drain all the oxygen from the room. The same way we handled the Riverside account. The phrase matched documentation Maya had already presented earlier in the hearing. Perfectly. When the recording ended, silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that settles over a room after everyone simultaneously realizes the same thing. Richard Whitmore didn't move. For several seconds, he simply sat there. Then he leaned toward his attorney. The two exchanged a few quiet words. Moments later, his legal team requested a recess. The request was granted. Richard stood, gathered his papers, and walked from the room surrounded by lawyers. He never looked toward the gallery, never looked toward the cameras, never looked toward his daughter. Ashley watched him leave, and in that moment, there was almost nothing left of the woman who had stood inside the Meridian 2 weeks earlier, believing she could do whatever she wanted without consequence. The transformation wasn't complete, but it had begun. That evening, the mayor's communications director issued a statement describing the recording as potentially manipulated and promising an aggressive legal challenge. The challenge never truly arrived. Events moved too quickly. By the following morning, 2 major campaign donors publicly suspended financial support. By noon, the state party chair released a statement expressing concern and encouraging full cooperation with investigators. By 3 o'clock, for city council members who had once stood firmly beside Richard Whitmore issued statements distancing themselves from his administration. The political collapse accelerated. Before the hearing, Richard's approval rating had stood at 61%. Public polling wouldn't be released for several weeks. Internal party numbers, however, painted a devastating picture. By the end of that week, support had fallen to 23%. The decline wasn't gradual. It was catastrophic. Richard Whitmore submitted his resignation on a Monday morning. The announcement came through a written statement. His communications director read it aloud because Richard himself never appeared. Everyone noticed. Reporters who had covered his career for years sat quietly in the press room. Recorders running, pens moving, listening carefully, not only to what was said, but to what wasn't. No apology, no accountability, no acknowledgement of the people harmed. Nothing resembling genuine remorse. The statement claimed Richard wished to focus on his family. It spoke about allowing the city to move forward. It described the resignation as a necessary step toward stability. One word never appeared. Sorry. Outside the Civic Center, supporters gathered holding signs. When the statement ended, no one cheered. No one shouted. Most simply stood there, silent. Some folded their signs and walked away. Others remained because they weren't sure what else to do. And around them, the city continued moving forward without asking permission. Ashley lost her old life slowly. Then all at once, the friends who had surrounded her at the Meridian disappeared over the following weeks with remarkable efficiency. At first, messages arrived less often. Then invitations stopped. Plans dissolved. Conversations ended. Not dramatically. Not with arguments. Just absence. Events she would normally attend appeared online without her. Photographs filled with familiar faces. People she knew. People she thought were friends. Gathered together in rooms where she was no longer invited. Strangely, Ashley didn't experience it as persecution. She experienced it as silence. And the silence gave her something she hadn't possessed in years. Time. Unstructured. Unoccupied. Uncomfortable. The video of the slap spread across social media faster than anyone could contain it. 3 separate recordings. Multiple angles. Good lighting. Clear audio. No ambiguity. It became inseparable from her name. No statement could erase it. No explanation could soften it. No publicist could spin it. Eventually, Ashley stopped going out. Stopped attending events. Stopped pretending. She spent long hours alone inside her apartment. The apartment was beautiful, expensive, carefully designed, and suddenly felt empty. She realized something during those weeks. A room built for a version of yourself becomes unbearable once that version disappears. Eventually, she contacted Maya through a mutual acquaintance, a city official who knew both women only casually. When Ashley reached out, the official showed neither surprise nor judgment. The request was passed along. Ashley simply asked whether Maya would meet her. No explanation, no justification, just a question. To her surprise, Maya agreed. They met at a small coffee shop on the east side of town. Nothing special, nothing exclusive, the kind of place where nobody cared who either of them was. Ashley arrived first. She sat in a corner booth, ordered coffee, never touched it. For 12 minutes, she rehearsed different versions of what she intended to say. Every version sounded wrong. Too small, too late, too inadequate. Then Maya arrived. She sat across from her. And for the first time since the night at the Meridian, Ashley looked directly at her. Not as an obstacle, not as a stranger, not as someone beneath her. Just another person sitting across a table. A human being. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Ashley spoke. 2 words. Simple, honest, and harder than anything she had ever said before. "I'm sorry. I need you to understand something," Ashley said quietly. "I know what I did was wrong. I know saying sorry doesn't erase it. And I'm not here because I expect forgiveness or because I want anything from you. I'm here because it was wrong, and I needed to say that directly to you." She had planned a longer speech. She had rehearsed explanations, prepared statements, justifications she hoped wouldn't sound like justifications. But once the truth was spoken, everything else felt unnecessary. So she stopped. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. Maya let it sit for a moment before responding. "I appreciate you coming." Her tone was calm, unforced, the same measured tone she seemed to use for everything. She studied Ashley carefully, not critically, not sympathetically, simply attentively. Then she said something Ashley would remember for years. "I don't carry that night as a wound." Ashley looked up. "But I want you to understand what actually happened." Maya folded her hands on the table. "The way you treated me in that restaurant wasn't really about me." Ashley didn't speak. It could have been anyone sitting there. Maya's voice remained steady. "You looked at me. You made assumptions about who I was, what I deserved, whether I belonged. Then you acted on those assumptions." A pause. That's the part worth examining. Ashley lowered her eyes. Maya continued. "Not your father. Not the investigation. Not everything that happened afterward." Another pause. The moment before. Ashley stared into her untouched coffee. "The reason you made that calculation." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Finally, Ashley nodded. "I know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about it every day." "Good." Maya's answer wasn't harsh. It was honest. Then she leaned back slightly and said something that landed with surprising force. "Power doesn't make anyone bigger." Ashley listened. "It just makes their choices louder." Maya shrugged lightly. What makes someone bigger is how they treat people they have nothing to gain from. She didn't deliver it like a lesson, or a speech, or a correction, just a belief, something she had learned long ago. Ashley sat quietly with the words. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded different than it had that night at the Meridian. Less polished, less certain, more real. I want to do something useful. Maya waited. With whatever I have left. Ashley gave a small, embarrassed laugh. I know how that sounds. She shook her head. But I need to do something that isn't about me. For a long moment, Maya simply looked at her. Then she nodded. Then do it. Ashley blinked. That's it. That's it. Maya offered the faintest smile. Find something worth doing. She picked up her cup. Do it badly. Ashley frowned. Maya smiled a little wider. Then keep doing it until you're better. The simplicity of the advice surprised her. But over time, she would discover it was exactly right. Ashley eventually found something worth doing. Not immediately, not dramatically, and certainly not in the way she once imagined. Because useful work rarely arrives with applause. It isn't glamorous. It isn't exciting. Most days, it's paperwork. Phone calls, waiting rooms, showing up when nobody notices. Eventually, she began volunteering at a community legal aid center on the south side of Caldwell City. The office occupied an aging building where the waiting room was perpetually crowded, and every employee seemed responsible for 3 jobs at once. The cases weren't famous. Most never made headlines. But every case mattered deeply to someone. That was enough. The South Side was a part of the city Ashley had largely ignored before. She had driven through it, past it, looked past it. Now she paid attention. She learned the streets, learned the names, learned the stories. Some mornings she took the bus because arriving in an expensive car still made her uncomfortable. Clients entered carrying folders filled with paperwork. Children holding their hands. Exhaustion hidden behind determined expressions. People trying very hard to keep their lives together. Ashley wasn't particularly good at the work in the beginning. She made assumptions, talked too much, offered solutions before fully understanding the problems. Sometimes she confused helping with directing. People corrected her, occasionally gently, occasionally not, and slowly she learned. She learned that listening was often more valuable than speaking. That presence mattered, that attention mattered, that showing up without an agenda was harder than it sounded. She had never really done it before, but she kept trying, and she stayed. Richard Whitmore was formally indicted that winter. 7 counts. Fraud, contract manipulation, obstruction of justice. 3 other city officials faced charges alongside him. The trial was scheduled for the following year. Sandra Kelleher received a public commendation from Eleanor Grant's office for her cooperation. Gerald Holt received something quieter, a handwritten note from Maya, and a formal letter restoring his professional record. It wasn't enough. Nothing could truly compensate for 11 years of integrity punished by political convenience. But it was something, a correction, a restoration of truth. Caldwell City appointed an interim mayor and launched a comprehensive review of every municipal contract awarded during Richard Whitmore's administration. The process was expected to take 18 months. Most experts believed additional indictments were inevitable. The city's ethics commission, which had spent years functioning as little more than decoration, was rebuilt entirely. New members, expanded authority, actual oversight. The original infrastructure contract was reopened. Independent auditors re-examined the work. The incomplete portions were rebid under a transparent process with federal monitoring. The project was eventually awarded to a company from a neighboring state. The final cost was $44 million, 31% lower than the amount originally billed. The numbers spoke for themselves. Maya didn't remain in Caldwell City long enough to see the trial. She never stayed for endings. Endings belonged to prosecutors, judges, juries. Her role was different. She built the file, connected the facts, found the truth, then moved on. There were always other cities, other investigations, other encrypted drives waiting to be opened, other names buried inside paperwork, other stories hiding beneath official narratives. On a Friday morning, she packed a rental car, the same car she had driven into Caldwell City weeks earlier. Leaving the same way felt appropriate. The late summer warmth had faded into early autumn. The campaign banners had disappeared. Those banners that once read Caldwell City, moving forward together with Richard Whitmore's name beneath them. Now the lampposts stood bare, waiting for whatever came next. Before leaving, Maya drove through the eastern neighborhood where she had grown up. The row house was still there. Narrow porch, familiar shape. A different family lived inside now. Children's toys scattered across the yard. A bicycle chained to the railing. Evidence of another life unfolding. She parked across the street and sat quietly, remembering. She pictured her father at the kitchen table. Folders spread everywhere. Yellow light from the lamp. Pen moving steadily across paper. Marcus Brooks had believed accountability mattered. Believed institutions could work. Believed truth eventually found its way to the surface. He hadn't been wrong. Not really. He had simply stood alone longer than he should have. The system failed him. Other people eventually didn't. The truth emerged. Justice arrived late. Far too late. But it arrived. She couldn't change what happened to him. Couldn't give him the years he lost. Couldn't let him see the outcome. What she could do was continue. Make the sacrifice mean something. Make sure the next person standing where Marcus Brooks once stood wouldn't have to fight alone for so long. That was enough. Or as close to enough as life usually allowed. Maya started the engine, pulled away from the curb, and headed toward the highway. Behind her, Caldwell City glowed beneath the morning sun. New buildings, redeveloped waterfronts, fresh projects, old scars, a city becoming whatever came next. She thought about the hearing room, about the 42-second recording that shattered years of carefully constructed lies, about Gerald Holt sitting proudly in his suit, about Ashley in the coffee shop finally saying the one thing that mattered. And she thought about her father, the folders, the kitchen table, the quiet determination of a man who believed truth was worth paying for, even when the price was unfair. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, bright beneath the morning light, leading toward another city, another case, another story waiting to be uncovered. For the first time since arriving, Maya switched on the radio, a habit she reserved for departures. Music filled the car. The windows were down. The wind carried away the last traces of Caldwell City. Ahead lay whatever came next, and she drove toward it without hesitation. Because the work was never really about recognition. It wasn't about headlines, or applause, or being remembered. The work only asked one thing, that someone be willing to do it. And so Maya did. The work continued, as it always would.